Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be taking a fascinating journey that many of us have actually had a touch in our lives, and that is one of Bruce Lee. On the program today, we're being joined back with Matthew Polly, who joined us back on the program back in 2008 with his book, American Shaolin, where he shared his experience in a Shaolin temple learning the martial arts. We're going to discover in this particular biography that he has written, which I find to be incredibly detailed, easy to read, and wonderfully fascinating as you discover things that transcend beyond the myths and the ideas about who Bruce Lee was. So I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book, Bruce Lee, A Life, Matthew Polly. Matthew, thank you for being back on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me on again. It's great to talk to you again, Daniel.
You know, it was funny. Last time we talked, you were talking about what it was like to train in a Shaolin temple, and I was pretty surprised that actually it wasn't as mystical as you might think as far as like when you think of the original series, Kung Fu, of how you have to sit out until somebody brings you in. So let's talk about what it is that you do that fascinates you, because you also wrote a book called Tapped Out as well. How you decided to pursue this direction with your life as a journalist?
You know, it kind of came upon me. I didn't have any particular, I just wanted to be a writer. And I had this experience at the Shaolin Temple, and friends of mine were like, you should turn that into a book. And so I wrote the book, I was on your show and a number, and it became a national bestseller. And that sort of pegged me as a martial arts writer. And it is one of my great passions in life. And so the next book I did, Tapped Out, where I studied mixed martial arts with the top people in the world, like Randy Couture. And then after that finished, my wife looked at me and she said, you need to find a book where you don't get punched in the face.
Well, I tell you, this one, though, I would have to say, I remember we were talking about Bruce Lee very briefly back when we were talking about your book, American Shaolin, and you were kind of mixed about what kind of a fighter you thought he was. Now, when I take a look at what I've read here in this book, it seems or appears anyway that perhaps maybe you've changed your view on him. Tell me about what you discovered as you actually did the research for this book.
Well, you know, that's true. I mean, Bruce has, there are detractors and there are fans of his. And as I did the research and looked into it, I found out that as far as I could tell, he was a first-rate martial artist. He really was a genius at what he did. This doesn't mean that, you know, he was invincible. He was 5'7", 135 pounds. You know, there are people on Earth who might have been able to beat him in a straight-up fight, but not very many. And so I was actually quite impressed through the research. You know, you never know exactly what you're going to find. And I found I liked Bruce Lee more after I had studied him than even before, and he had been one of my childhood heroes.
And I think he was for a lot of us, too. You know, of course, I grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles, you know, and so a lot of the Asian-influenced films were certainly on the scene there, and Bruce Lee was certainly the talk of the town. I remember when I used to buy Kung Fu and Black Belt magazines, and I never actually even took classes in it, but the thing that I found myself over the years is Bruce Lee was one of those kind of people like Muhammad Ali that was shrouded in a tremendous amount of mystery in many ways, to where you found yourself magnetized wanting to know, who are these people? Now, and in saying this, so over the years, you know, when there would be a documentary, I would kind of pop in and I'd watch that. Or, you know, there might be a movie about it. Like one of the movies that I used to always get a kick out of watching was called Bruce Lee, the Myth, the Legend. You know, you know the one I'm talking about. Now you can find it on streaming everywhere. And but there was one time I came across a documentary, and to me it seemed to be the pinnacle documentary of Bruce Lee, and that was called Bruce Lee, A Warrior's Journey by John Little. And what I didn't know was, as I was perusing around the Multnomah County Library in Portland, Oregon, is that was actually a book that John Little wrote about Bruce Lee that morphed into a biography, into, you know, a film biography. And I was like, to me it seemed to be one of the best documentaries about Bruce Lee's life, but it really centered around the film Game of Death, which never got finished, which he actually started with the ending. But what he was trying to share was, and to me this is what became fascinating, was what Bruce Lee was truly trying to give to the world. Now let's talk about, for instance, what you discovered and what you think, because I see that beginning to emerge. I've gotten almost halfway through your book, and I can't wait to finish it.
Because it's like 600 pages.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and talk about what do you think emerged for you as you were putting this all together?
Well, first let me just say, endorse what you did, which is John Little's documentary, A Warrior's Journey. John's a good friend of mine, and he was extremely helpful in the research. In fact, he fact-checked the book for me.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was honored by it because he's one of the great Bruce Lee experts. I think what's interesting about Bruce Lee in my sort of research, an overarching theme was that the image – Bruce Lee is the only celebrity to become famous after he died. His movie Enter the Dragon was released a month after his tragic death at the age of 32 in 1973. And so there wasn't a celebrity persona. He didn't have a lot written about him beforehand. And so people didn't really know who he was. And basically they went and they watched Enter the Dragon and then the 3 movies, kung fu movies he made in Hong Kong. And they thought of him solely as this kung fu master, almost mystical, zen, deep kung fu master, which is true. But what they missed was he came from an entertainment family. His father was an actor. Bruce appeared in front of his first movie camera when he was 2 months old. By the time he was 18, he had made 20 films, and none of those films were kung fu movies. Bruce was actually the Macaulay Culkin of Hong Kong. He played orphans and street urchins, and so as I got to know him better from his childhood, what evolved was the sense of Bruce Lee as an actor, and an actor who had fallen in love with the martial arts, and then as an adult merged those two passions to become a martial arts movie star.
Now, here's the other thing I did, and I couldn't help myself, but in the back of my mind as I was reading this biography, I also had in the back Rob Cohen's film back in the early part of the 1990s, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, okay? Because I was looking at, when I was watching that movie, and I thought, okay, well, I didn't know that one of his first students was black, and it turns out that in your book that you affirm this. Which was, what was his name? Is Jesse Glover, I believe his name was.
Exactly.
So you're taking a look at these, and you're watching how loosely Rob Cohen does this, but how accurate certain points of his movie were. And it was funny because I was talking with, it was my brother's brother-in-law, and he actually had a karate studio in a small town. And I asked him, I said, so what did you think about that Bruce Lee the Dragon movie? And he had this kind of smirk and kind of nodded his head a little bit. He goes, well, it shows, as if Bruce Lee had a life. So, but did you find anything in there that seemed accurate? He says, I'm not so sure about it, but it was really interesting how Rob, for instance, the scene where he's washing dishes, and the chef pulls out the cleaver, and Bruce Lee's like, and in your book you say, I dare you to go ahead and use that against me, that actually happened. So it was interesting how you've seen the nuances in this film, and you realize, but he didn't train with Ip Man as young as the film shows. It wasn't until, I think he was, 15 or 16 years old.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that movie is interesting because it sort of forms every sort of person's idea kind of who Bruce Lee was, and it's got parts that are totally true, and then parts that are totally made up. And it was largely told, and this was a choice they made, to focus on the love affair between Bruce and his wife Linda. And I think that's a very important part of Bruce Lee's life, but it's not the only part. And what I wanted to do in this book, which, when you have 600 pages, you got a lot more time than a 2-hour movie, was to really dig into who he was growing up, because that movie totally skips that, and what his family was like, what his background was, and how that shaped the sort of decisions he made once he returned to America and started to set out on his career.
So that being said, I thought that would be a great place to actually spend some time, seeing how I'm almost halfway through the book, and we're at the point now, actually, the chapter I'm beginning to start is where he actually has the face-off against the Chinese guy that challenges him. I think it's in San Francisco or somewhere. So we'll go ahead and worry about that another time. Let's go ahead and go way back now. What I found unique is most people, know Bruce Lee as being Chinese, but the fact is he's very mixed. So let's go back into his family tree here and talk about that.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing, and that's one of the great revelations of the book. Previously, most Bruce Lee fans knew that he was part European, that he was somewhat mixed, Eurasian, and what they had said, and I think even his family didn't, like Bruce's siblings, didn't know the truth, that his grandfather was a German Catholic. And it turns out that his great-grandfather was Dutch Jewish, the son of a butcher, kosher butcher in Rotterdam, Holland, who came over to Hong Kong and bought himself a Chinese concubine, and with her had 6 children who grew up to become the richest men in Hong Kong. And Bruce's maternal grandfather had 13 concubines and also had an affair with a British woman who was Bruce's grandmother. And so Bruce is 5/8 Han Chinese, 1/4 English, and 1/8 Dutch Jewish. So he was a little bit of everything.
A true American, actually, without even realizing it yet.
Exactly.
Now, what was also fascinating, too, is you consider his mom. Let's go ahead and take a look at his parents now. His mother actually came from a very prominent, wealthy background. In fact, I believe it was her uncle or father, I can't remember right offhand, who was the wealthiest man in Hong Kong.
Right.
Okay.
Her uncle was the wealthiest, and her father was the second wealthiest.
Okay, yeah.
And so what I think special about the relationship is that Bruce's father was kind of straight up Chinese peasant family. They were, barely making by, trying to survive in southern China. The father could barely afford to feed the kids. And he was apprenticed as a Chinese opera singer, and that's how he got out of poverty. But he was still pretty poor. He was a struggling actor. When he was performing with their troupe in front of her uncle in their fabulous mansion, his mother's uncle. And she saw him on stage, and she fell in love with him, and she defied her family, who didn't want her to marry a struggling actor. They wanted her to marry some rich guy, and ran off with him. And so it was at that point in time, almost all marriages in China were arranged. And so this was a kind of rebellious move, and I think that speaks to some of Bruce's personality, because he was a rebel who was always challenging authority. And I think he got some of that from his mother, who made the romantic decision to marry the man she loved, not to marry the man her parents wanted her to.
What's even fascinating about Bruce's father is the fact that he actually became prominent. Although they started off poor, he eventually started investing in apartments, and he started building wealth to a point they had their own driver. You're looking at servants, things like that. And so, there was actually a culture that was created of comfort, if you will. But yet Bruce Lee just couldn't seem to settle still. Now, what I really enjoyed was the name that he had, which is Li Jianfan. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of interesting. Now, let's describe how he came to get that name there and what it actually translates to.
So he was born in San Francisco when his father was touring. His father and mother were touring America. His father was performing, and his mother worked as a seamstress behind the stage. And so his mother gave him the name, which means to shake up or to excite San Francisco, in honor of her birth town. Of his birth town, and so of course Bruce Lee shook up and excited the whole world, not just San Francisco. So when they were naming him, they were thinking too small.
Well, not to mention, that beginning of the chapter, the face-off. That's exactly
right.
What he's about to do. Now, the other thing that I didn't know about too. Now, first of all, you also cover a lot of ground, which I remember John Little talked a lot about this in his biography, but that Bruce Lee really took to fighting. This was something that he really loved to do, and he actually seemed to be to hunger for it. What was it that you think really moved him in that direction as a young kid?
One thing was that he was the youngest child. So, his older brother was the studious, serious one, what we think of as the kind of stereotypical Chinese-American scholar type student. And Bruce Lee was the rebel. He was the one who was always getting into trouble. He might have been somewhat ADHD. His nickname as a kid was Never Sit Still, and they couldn't calm him down, basically, and he couldn't sit still in class. And the only time he seemed to find a kind of peace was when he would get into fights. And so from a very early age, he was this pugnacious kid who would start fights, and he wasn't a bully. He didn't pick on the little kid. He just fought everybody. And that was what led him to an interest in martial arts, not for self-defense, but actually to be a better street fighter.
Now, as he was growing up, too, it was at a point where his parents didn't know how to really control him and get him focused. He wasn't really much of a school student either.
No, so he was acting in movies. He did about a couple movies a year as a child actor. And I think that maybe also been part of it. We know that child actors have a tendency to get into trouble. But he was a rotten student. He was usually the worst or the second worst in class, and he was always getting into fights. And there was one incident where the PE teacher kind of switched him with a long stream of grass. And Bruce turned around and pulled a knife on his PE teacher as a 13-year-old, right? Mm-hmm. Where coming from such a nice family, it's not something you're supposed to do. And that eventually led him to being kicked out of this very prestigious parochial school that he was attending. And then they sent him to another school, and he wasn't much better as a student there. And so eventually he got into so many fights that the police came around and told his mother if they couldn't stop him, he'd be thrown in jail. And that's why they decided to send him back to his country of birth. America was Bruce Lee's reform school.
And the other thing, too, is his father, because this was also at a time that he was really ravenous about acting. This was something that, he could care less about school, but he loved acting. And so his father and mother were kind of taking a look at this and thought, well, maybe we can use this as a motivation. Bruce, if you don't get focused, we're not going to let you act. And so they were actually using that as a disciplinary action, weren't they?
Yeah, that I thought was amazing because you think of, I wondered whether or not he had stage parents, the type of people who were pushing him towards this, but it was actually the opposite. His father didn't want his children to grow up to be actors. He knew how tough the business was. He wanted them to be academics, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, prestigious professional jobs. But Bruce Lee, was doing this, and they sort of reluctantly let him go along. But whenever he got into trouble at school, they refused to let him do any more movies. And so for a couple years, there are gaps in his record, and that's because his parents put him in a kind of movie acting timeout and wouldn't let him act until he shaped up. I
know there was one period of time you were noting that went 2 years, I believe it was.
Yeah, 2 years he didn't appear in a film because he wouldn't obey them. So they did their best to be strict, but you could tell in reading it that it was, if you have enough children, you usually have that one that you just, keeps you up at night, and Bruce Lee was that kid. That was they were saving bail money for Bruce Lee.
Pretty much. And what I want the listeners to note about your biography, too, is that you also infuse rich history about the times and the things that China was going through, specifically Hong Kong, especially when it comes to British rule and the idea of the opium and the opium wars. And why that's important, because then you get to see why Bruce Lee also was bubbling underneath in trouble as far as his relationship with his father, because his father actually was an opium addict, I understand.
Yeah, and that's something that has been mentioned in the past, but I don't think anyone made the connection to Bruce Lee's sort of troubled teenage years with the fact that his father was an addict. As you mentioned, I think this is crucial, Hong Kong only exists because the British were selling opium to China, and China tried to stop them, and England went to war to force them to be allowed to sell opium. And so Hong Kong was essentially a drug port. And most of the elites, and particularly opera singers, smoked opium. And I think it was one of those cases where when Bruce was young, his father had control over it and could still work and do everything and smoke opium occasionally. But over time, the drug gripped him, and he sank into, a downward spiral. And so Bruce had a lot of conflicted feelings about his father. And I think he was acting out in ways because he was, his father wasn't mentally there for him.
And then another thing to note, too, is that his father actually slowly began to evolve toward film, but there was a point, especially when the Japanese came in and they were invading and they were taking over the Hong Kong film industry, saying you can make films as long as they're more of a propaganda and a praise for who we are. And there was a point that actually defined his father's life and his direction. When he was about to do a film, they said, he just simply said, no, I'm not going to do it. Explain what happened there, because that was really a turning point that could have actually changed maybe this whole story here.
Yeah, that's one of the things I thought is fascinating about Bruce and anybody's life, is you look at the choices that are made, but also the context in which things happen. If one thing goes this way or that way, everything ends up being different. And so this was a great moment. Bruce's father was forced to act on the stage as a Cantonese opera actor during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, which was unbelievably brutal. A third of the population was killed. It was that bad, and people were starving to death, and there was cholera epidemics. It was just the worst thing imaginable. And so the Japanese, in the middle of this occupation, decided they were going to make a propaganda film extolling the beauties of the Japanese occupation, and of course, completely untrue. And they went to a bunch of the famous Chinese actors, like Bruce's father, and told them they had to participate. And Bruce's father quite courageously refused. And why this is important is because after the occupation ended, every actor who participated in that film was blacklisted as a collaborator with the Japanese. And Bruce's father, who didn't, was allowed to keep acting in Hong Kong. And if he had made a different choice under that pressure, his career would have ended like those other actors, and Bruce would have had a very different life.
Yeah, he certainly wouldn't be acting, that's for sure. And that was really one of his passions, but certainly he considered probably his biggest prize, and I wonder if he considered this all the way until the end of his days, was that he was a cha-cha champion. Now, what I like about that, that was something I discovered reading your book. You know, and what's funny is you go back to that Rob Cohen film, and so you see glimpses of how Rob kind of effectively used this in a creative way. As there's the scene where you see all the Chinese teenagers dancing, and then those Australian sailors come in and tear the place up. And here's what I like about the way Rob used that. So you see that going on. You can tell it's kind of an American dance these Chinese kids are doing. And then when the trouble ensues, Bruce Lee comes up from the stairs. Now he's dressed in a white shirt, a tie, and glasses. Now what I liked about that is that in your book you also talk about that's how Bruce Lee would do his presentations in Kung Fu, is that he would show himself as a small Asian studious student, as though he's creating a Steve Jobs kind of a presentation. So he was actually doing Steve Jobs before Steve Jobs was.
Right.
Anyway, let's talk about that.
So Cha-Cha Champion. So this is one of, I think, the most delightful things about Bruce, and something not many people know, which was his love for dance. He was a teenage kid at the time. Hong Kong was very westernized, and there were a lot of American and British sailors there because it was a port of call for the Korean War. And they had the radios going on, and so he picked up all the hip dances of the 1950s. He did the Lindy Hop, the Jive, the Boogie Woogie, but his true love was Cha-Cha. And so there was a huge contest that was being thrown to determine who was the Cha-Cha champion of Hong Kong. And this is what I thought was amazing about Bruce and his cleverness, and why I think he succeeded in life, because he always figured out a way to win. And that was, he could have chosen between one of the many young women that he sort of dated and was friends with, but that would have been like everybody else entering the contest. Instead, he ended up picking his 10-year-old super cute youngest brother, Robert, as his partner. And of course, the Chinese love children, and they love sons. And so as soon as they stepped on stage, they were so adorable that they almost automatically won, regardless of their skill level. And so Bruce was a first-rate dancer, but he won that contest because he picked his younger brother, and he knew when he did that he was gaining an advantage.
Now, some of the women that you had actually interviewed for the biography who were girlfriends and friends of Bruce also talked about how quickly adaptable he was about picking up moves as well.
That's right. So Bruce most of what he succeeded in life was through cleverness and sheer force of will. But he did have an innate talent, which was one of his girlfriends in college, Amy Sambo, said he was a kinetic genius, that he could just look at a move and incorporate it. And as soon as he was shown something physical, he could do it. And this seems to have been noted by many people. Martial arts instructors would show him something, and very quickly he could do it better than them. And so he just had an incredible physical ability to adapt new moves and new techniques. And I think this was associated also with his skills as a dancer. He really was a kind of the Baryshnikov of martial arts.
And I think, too, when you take a look at the idea of the dancing and you see how he was with the fighting and you see that he always had this innate need to actually win, as you said, that was something that he was compulsive about, if you will, is that was really his true talent. It was like, now going back to the John Little biography, that he was really beginning to emerge, especially when he came to America. His philosophy, he was starting to become self-aware. I'm beginning to get what I believe is a glimpse, as they would say in Japanese Zen, of the ox's tail, what life is really about. And what I loved about the John Little biography is it talks about how he was truly in pursuit of spiritually expressing himself honestly. And it was through these mediums that he was beginning to say, this is how I can go about doing that. That it was more than just fighting. It was more than just technique, but it was truly to say, I want to show the world this is how you can truly learn to express yourself. Was that the kind of idea and attitudes that you got as well as when you were researching the book?
Yeah, I mean, I may have even mentioned this when I was talking about American Shaolin, but a joke I've had for a long time is that Kung Fu is China's way of tricking 13-year-old boys into meditating.
I remember reading that.
Yeah, and so I think that that's key. The martial arts starts with like 13-year-old boys who are into fighting, or they're troublemakers, or they're hyperactive, or they're kids who are like me, who are kind of bullied, who want to learn how to defend themselves. The more, appealing version of it. But as you get older, you find another aspect to the martial arts, which is really a kind of spiritual path that people can go on and find their center. And Bruce, about the age of 18 or 19, had a spiritual awakening, a kind of moment of an enlightenment, where he realized that for him, water was the essence of the universe in the sense that it was flexible, and it couldn't be broken, and it could fit into anything. And I think this is fascinating because Bruce himself as a personality was very much a fire element. He was called the Little Dragon. He had a hot temper. He burned with ambition. And so trying to be more like water for Bruce was a way to self-correct his own character makeup. But as he got older, he wasn't just trying to do martial arts to be a better fighter. He also was searching for his own sort of sense of internal peace and harmony. And that's something he wanted to convey in his movies. And I think, right before he died, the movie Game of Death he was working on was going to be just about that. And so his career started in those kind of revenge-driven kung fu movies, but he really was into the philosophical aspects, and he pushed really hard to try to get that on film. And if he had lived longer, I think we would have seen whole other dimensions of Bruce Lee on film.
I'm certain of that. Now, one thing, or a couple of things we haven't talked about, but one that's really important to talk about is Linda and how they came to meet. Now, Bruce Lee was quite a player back in his day. This is a guy that was good looking, he had a lot of talent, and charisma. The other thing that was kind of funny to note, too, is as you watch him on film, you think of this guy that seems reflectively quiet all the time. But quite frankly, the only way to shut Bruce Lee up was to ask him about his studies.
yeah, that was one of his female friends has that line. The only way to shut Bruce Lee up was to ask him how his academics were doing. So there were periods where he could be quiet. He loved to read, but when he was out with friends, he was the center of attention. He was a showman. He was an entertainer, and I think that's something that appealed to Linda, who was one of his students. She had seen him give a lecture and found him sort of attractive and beautiful, and she joined his class just because she was, kind of into him. And eventually Bruce asked her out on a date, and she was surprised because she didn't think she was as gorgeous as the women he typically dated, because he was a charmer and he had a lot of dates. But they ended up making a real connection, and I think because she was the yin to his yang, that she was the quiet, steady one, and he was the volatile, extroverted charmer, that they became two halves of a whole, and that's the connection that made it work for them.
And it was even stated, too, by one of the interviews that you had done, is that it was because of Linda and her steadiness that Bruce Lee was able to get to the levels that he was able to.
Yeah, I think she doesn't get enough credit. People like to focus on Bruce Lee because he's so charismatic. It's very hard to see around him. But if he had married a different type of woman, someone who wasn't as steady and supportive and kind of just the thing about Linda is she's solid as a rock. Like, she can't be broken. And the reason we know this is she's gone through two horrific tragedies. She lost her husband and her son, and yet she's still an incredibly dignified, wonderful woman. When I met her and interviewed her for the book, I was very impressed by who she was. And I think his friends recognized that by marrying Linda, he had made the sensible choice. He hadn't gone with the flashy, glamorous girl. He'd gone with the one with real depth. And I don't think anybody would have been able to go through some of the troubles he did. He spent years and years struggling in Hollywood and barely had two dimes to rub together. And she was always there, always supporting him, and always believing in him. And I think that's what he needed to succeed.
Absolutely. What was it like? I mean, because you had interviewed Linda, what was it like to sit and talk with her? What were your feelings in those moments?
One of the things I thought was interesting is, for example, Dragon, the Bruce Lee movie, was based on her book, and it's very glowing. And we all know that, like, every man has flaws, and Bruce Lee had flaws too. And I was wondering, why her, vision of Bruce was always so positive. And as I talked to her, I realized that to this day how much she loves him. Mm-hmm. And there was a kind of devotion and intense love and respect that she had for Bruce Lee that it shocked me 40 years after his death that it was still that present. And I think Bruce fed on that. And I think that's part of the reason everyone has such a positive image of Bruce, is because Linda's been out there very strongly arguing for the best things about Bruce Lee.
Understood. Now, another thing we haven't talked too much about was that in his relationship with Ip Man. Now, yeah. Netflix actually has, and I watched all three of them. I was very impressed with just the choreography and the scenes alone and the way Donnie Yen plays Ip Man. But let's talk about who Ip Man was, because there were also some unique historical ways that they put those movies together. And in fact, after the first one, they go on to say, well, he went on to train Bruce Lee, but it was actually one of his students, as I understand from what you wrote, that really did most of the training of Bruce Lee. Is that true?
That's true. So what people don't understand is in a kung fu school, the master, the head instructor, mostly focuses on his senior students, and the senior students teach the junior students. So he's like the principal. And then he doesn't teach grade school, right? And so when Bruce was first starting, he was, a first-year beginner white belt student. He wasn't spending a lot of time studying with Yip Man. He was studying with a young man named Wang Shunlong, who was one of Yip Man's senior students. And so Yip Man would, give him some pointers here and there, and he was officially the master, but, Bruce Lee had a different teacher day to day.
Again, I think fans of Bruce Lee will find this to be not only a very thorough, but it's been a very enjoyable read, very smooth. I can't wait to finish the book. And I was going to ask you about those inside cover photographs, the one you have of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bruce Lee. Now, this is something I don't know, but did he ever work with or train Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or was it just this movie that they worked on together?
No, they did. That's how they met. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is a fascinating guy because he had a kind of he was a seeker. He was always looking for different, interesting things, and he walked into Black Belt magazine's offices and asked them if they had any books on Aikido, and they said they didn't, and he was interested in Tai Chi, and the person there said, if you want to learn about Chinese martial arts, you should meet Bruce Lee. And so Bruce Lee was at Kareem for a year while he was still at UCLA before he went on into the pros. Studied under Bruce Lee a couple times a week, once a week, something like that, and learned Bruce's style of martial arts from him. And they remained friends. And when Bruce went on to Hong Kong and became, a huge star there, he asked Kareem if he would be in a movie with him because Bruce said, Chinese audiences have never seen a Chinese guy fight a 7'2" African American. If they see me kicking him in the face, they're going to freak out. And so he thought it was an amazing opportunity. And of course, those scenes in A Game of Death where Bruce is fighting Kareem Abdul-Jabbar remain some of the classics of all time.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I wanted to know about that, and I was sensing that he was actually trained by Bruce Lee, is when you think about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and his career with the Los Angeles Lakers and that of the deadly skyhook, to me it was like the epitome of who Bruce Lee was and his influence maybe perhaps even in the sport of basketball. And we're not saying that he actually said, hey, Kareem, try this, but just think about this for a minute. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as far as I understand, still holds the all-time scoring record for the most points scored in a career. Okay, and he had the devastating skyhook, was probably the most simple, direct weapon you can use in the NBA that's unblockable. Now, when you think about this and you think about Bruce Lee and what he was evolving, especially as he came to America, was to show that here were all these styles of karate and kung fu, and you do this, 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 and this before you do this. Bruce Lee was saying, look, in a street fight, you don't have all that time to dance around. I want something that's very direct and simple. And so when I share this with people, they're like, well, did he really train Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? And I would always say, yes, he did, but now I know for a fact that he did. I haven't gotten to that part yet. But when you think of how devastating the skyhook is, you can almost sense like almost a spirit of Bruce Lee in a way saying, just do it simple. Boom, and it was unstoppable.
You know what? No one has ever made that point. That's a great, great, great point. That I think that there's a real truth to that, which is Bruce didn't obviously tell Kareem Abdul-Jabbar how to play basketball because Bruce didn't know how to play that sport. But he taught him about his philosophy, which is to keep it simple and be efficient. And the key of hitting someone and not getting hit back. And, that skyhook is very much like his Jeet Kune Do philosophy. So thank you. That's brilliant. I'd never thought of that before, but I think you're quite right.
I couldn't help it, how I brought those two together and thought, just think about this for a minute, and then you think of people like Chuck Norris and how they work together, and then you think of Steve McQueen. Now, there was another relationship, too, as well, that although they seem to have had a falling out because, as I understand it from something my wife was briefly reading in your book, she says, it seems Steve McQueen says, look, Bruce, I'm not going to let you just ride my coattail into becoming a movie star. Let's talk a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah, so one of the things that's fascinating about Bruce is even when he was kind of not a very important figure in Hollywood, he met all the most amazing people there, and they became his students. And you think about just that. I mean, he would have been an interesting character just because he was the kung fu instructor to James Coburn, Steve McQueen, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So the interesting thing about Steve is that they had a kind of mutual respect, mutual kind of envy relationship. Steve wanted to be as good a fighter as Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee wanted to be as big a star as Steve McQueen. And you think of the ambition you would have to think as a Chinese American who just got here that you could be a bigger star than the biggest box office star in the world in America during a time of great racial discrimination. But for whatever reason, Bruce Lee had that kind of drive. And so he was trying to talk Steve into making a kung fu movie with him. But Steve, who was very savvy, realized, if I make this movie, I'm going to be helping to create competition. After I make this, Bruce Lee will be a bigger star, but he could never get this movie made without me. And so he felt like Bruce Lee was trying to use him a little bit, which I think Bruce Lee was. And so he turned him down and said, quite bluntly, I'm not going to let you ride my coattails. I'm not going to carry you on my back. And Bruce Lee was furious and vowed that one day he would be a bigger star than Steve McQueen. And so, in a way, I think he succeeded, because if you went around the world and asked people, who do you recognize, more people would recognize Bruce Lee than they do Steve McQueen.
Absolutely. I mean, he's right up there with Muhammad Ali. You say Bruce Lee or Muhammad Ali, everybody knows who those guys are.
Exactly.
So, again, I want to applaud you, and I can't wait to finish reading the book here. Bruce Lee, A Life is the book. Our guest joining us today on the Beyond 50 radio program today, Matthew Pauly. Matthew, I just have to ask, okay, so as you did your research thoroughly, what were, let's talk about at least two of them if possible, myths that circulate out there about who Bruce Lee is, what he did, just anything like that you realize, this is just not true?
Well, one of them is actually from the movie Dragon, where there's a scene where Bruce Lee comes up for the idea of Kung Fu, the TV series, and then has it stolen from him. And as you'll see as you get to that part of the book, that's not true at all. The TV series Kung Fu was written by two Jewish comedy writers from Brooklyn. The people you'd least expect to write the TV series Kung Fu.
Well, they were Jewish, so was Bruce Lee.
Exactly.
He just wasn't a writer until later in life.
Exactly. He wasn't a comedy writer either. But yes, so Ed Spielman and Howard Friedlander came up with the screenplay for Kung Fu, which was originally supposed to be a movie, and Bruce Lee was talked to about it when it was a movie project. And then later on, they switched. They couldn't get it made as a movie, so they turned it into a TV show. And Bruce auditioned for the part, but it was given to David Carradine. And I talked to all the people involved, and the guy who made the decision, who actually rejected Bruce Lee, when I first got on the phone with him, he was like, "Don't hate me. I'm the guy who told Bruce Lee no." That it's important to sort of give credit where credit is due, and Bruce didn't come up with the TV series Kung Fu. So that's one of the myths that I think I found. The other one I thought was interesting and really kind of humanizing for me is to understand that he was an actor in the 60s, and so hanging out with Steve McQueen and James Coburn, he liked to get high with them. Like he would smoke pot with Steve McQueen, who introduced him to it, and also James Coburn. And that's something you don't think about when you think about Bruce Lee's image as this, dedicated martial artist.
Somebody who's purely drinking green smoothies every day.
Exactly.
You realize now there's the human part of it, that they like to get high because it's a way that they can philosophically evolve the human spirit, I suppose.
That's right. He would get, it was like sophomore year in college. He would get high and he would talk philosophy with his celebrity friends, and that was the way he liked to kind of relax. And kind
of like they should have inserted him in that scene in Animal House when that's happening with David Sutherland.
Exactly. It would be hilarious if Bruce Lee shows up.
Well, this is a great book. Again, I was really when I heard about this, the producer, I said, "Yeah, get that. I definitely, want to see a really good biography on this," and this certainly lives up to that and more. And I've really enjoyed, everything we've talked about here today. Is there a website, Matthew, people can find out more about your work and maybe how they can get Bruce Lee a life?
Yeah, so they can go to mattpolly.com, mattpolly.com. And, of course, Bruce Lee's available everywhere, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, which everyone should support. You can get the book anywhere, and you can learn more about me at my website.
Very good. Matthew, again, it's been a pleasure to have you back on the program again on this one. Look forward to something else that you may be coming up with. Any ideas? Anything stewing around up there?
I might. Would you have me on if I wrote a biography of Clint Eastwood?
Hey, absolutely. I love Clint Eastwood.
There we go. Sold. Then I'm going to do it.
All right, you do it. All right, Matthew, thank you again for being on the program today.
All right, you take care, sir.
You bet. Want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.